So I'm Maia Hallward, and I am a professor of Middle East politics at Kennesaw State University outside of Atlanta. And we are here today to discuss Jonathan Kuttab's book, The Truth Shall Set You Free, as well as talk about some of the issues contemporarily in the region more broadly. I long ago was an intern at Nonviolence International, so I'm very pleased to be here with you all today. As hopefully most of you know, Nonviolence International is a backbone organization in the global nonviolence movement. Nonviolence International provides fiscal sponsorship and training, spreads knowledge and transformation stories of dynamic and emerging nonviolent movements around the globe. And this can give hope in difficult times. And so we're trying to reshape our view of what is possible. And help give people creative ideas of what can be done and how we can change the world together. So today we're launching Nonviolent International's co-founder, Jonathan Kuttab's second book.
I see him as a man of authority because he's known as the patriarch of the people.
If you can please make sure that you unmute yourself. Thank you. The Truth Shall Set You Free, which is a memoir of his life as an international human rights lawyer and nonviolent activist for justice in Palestine. Jonathan will also be joined by Mubarak Awad, who is, among his many titles, the founder of Nonviolence International and a longtime leader in the nonviolent movement for justice in Palestine. After we hear from both Jonathan and Mubarak, we'll open the floor for our question and answer. So we're going to begin with Jonathan, who is a member of the bar in Israel, Palestine, and New York, as a co-founder of Nonviolence International, and Al-Haq, which is a premier human rights organization, and is executive director of Friends of Sabeel Liberation Theology Movement in the United States, also known as FOSNA by its acronym. In addition to his memoir, The Truth Shall Set You Free, Jonathan is the author of Beyond the Two-State Solution, which explores what one binational state in Palestine and Israel could look like. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you very much. This is wonderful. I'd like to say two things basically about the book. First, this book came almost as a consequence of my writing Beyond the Two-State Solution, where many people told me there's something missing in that book. We need the story. People react to stories. They don't react to analysis and position papers and political argument. They react to stories. So where is your story? How did you come to this position? That was the first impetus. The second was my brother suggested that it is time to write the story about the nonviolence. This is like, it's almost 50 years to the beginning of the occupation. It's, we no longer talk about the occupation really because it's one stage of an ongoing saga that Palestinians have been suffering since 48 and before that. But also it is important to remember and to tell the story of nonviolence. And if you have had a chance to read the book at all, you will see that nonviolence plays a very important part in it. A lot of it is stories relating to Mubarak Awad, for example, and his role during the Second Intifada. A lot of the book is actually about what happened in the Second Intifada, what happened before and what came after it. So I'd like to say that it's a more fun book to read than than Beyond the Two-State Solution, precisely because it has those stories and those personal elements. And I'm very curious to hear some of your reactions to it, and certainly where things are going from now on and what we can do about it. So this is what I wanted to say, these 2 points about the book. But I'd like to also hear your reactions and what you think about it.
What I I might take a moderator's privilege and ask you to say, if you were going to share your two favorite takeaway points from the book that you would hope that anyone who read the book would walk away with, what would you say those two takeaway points would be?
Well, the first is that this really is a story of one Palestinian, happens to be Christian, happens to be very active in nonviolence, happens to be a human rights attorney. But it's about my own spiritual pilgrimage. How did I come to this position? And it's very much aimed also at the Christian. The Christian element and the nonviolent element are very essential to the story. But the second important point, I think, comes towards the end, at the last chapter. Where are we now? Where do we move from here? A lot of my own, shall we say, political journey was caught up in the whole two-state solution. The experience under occupation, the hope, the vision of a two-state solution, the creation of a Palestinian state in a small portion of Palestine, 22% of it, setting up a Palestinian state, basically, and what that would mean, what are its structures, and how it would relate to Israel and to the rest of the world. And so that particular vision, that particular paradigm, that particular story has been totally destroyed, has been thoroughly crushed. It's amazing that people would even continue to speak about a two-state solution when everybody who's at all familiar with the situation knows that that is no longer on the cards at all. So the crushing of that particular story or vision or paradigm, and we haven't done enough to think about the new paradigm. What comes in its place? What story, what vision, what goal, what hopes do we have going forward? And I'm speaking here about people who care, people who have an interest in justice, in human rights, people who have at least some level of empathy and sympathy for both sides of this equation. Where do we go now if there is not going to be a Palestinian state?
Yeah, and Jonathan, maybe you could also tell us a little bit about, I think one of the major stories in this book was also your, as you mentioned, your spiritual journey and also your own path to nonviolent option, a nonviolent resistance option. Maybe you could share a little bit about how you came to that perspective and what has kept you on that perspective throughout these years, even as now that there is no, as you say, it does not seem like there's a chance for a two-state solution. How did you manage to continue to stay committed to nonviolence through that?
Well, that is almost an easier question to answer because I grew up in basically a Christian home where faith was a very important part of my upbringing. And people in the West don't realize it, but the vast majority of Palestinian Christians from all different denominations tend to be pacifist, tend to read the Bible or the New Testament or the teachings of Christ to really outlaw or consider violence really outside of what we should do. So it's easy for me as a Christian Palestinian to fall into the nonviolence thing from a purely spiritual, religious point of view. But what I learned over the years was that totally apart from its spiritual value, nonviolence is a very useful, pragmatic, realistic, rational approach for Palestinians to take at this point in their history. And this is an important point to make. I'm not saying that Palestinians don't have the right to armed resistance. Of course we do. That's a legitimate position. It's a legitimate right. Some people would even say it's a duty for people living under oppression to resist and to take up arms against their oppressors and tormentors. But what I have realized is that it would not be rational, it would not be feasible, it would not be useful for us to resort to armed struggle when nonviolence provides us a much more effective method of working for our liberation and for our rights, for a whole number of reasons. Part of it, of course, has to do with a tremendous power imbalance. Part of it has to do with the fact that our oppressors have gone through a traumatic experience with the Holocaust and what went before it and after it, which makes them particularly sensitive to any physical threat against them. Because Zionist tells them violence is the only way. You need weapons. We need to arm ourselves. So any kind of armed resistance to their supremacy only reinforces that trauma of Holocaust. It's a trauma that they need to overcome, they need to heal from. I know it's unfair that we Palestinians have to worry about their traumas, but we have to. This is the reality. And nonviolence offers us a realistic path to resist, to fight without inflaming that trauma and without inviting resort to really massive violence against ourselves by our oppressors. I don't know if I've made that point sufficiently clear. I'm saying Palestinians have the right to resist, of course, but we also can resist non-violently, and that would be much more effective and useful for us, regardless of whether we are philosophically or religiously or spiritually committed to nonviolence.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. I think you make another really good point in your book. One of the ones I really appreciated was the role of al-Haq and the role of your human rights activism, and particularly your very, very strict adherence to testimony collection and adherence to norms and legal and international regulations that were very, very strict and high standards. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the role of how that human rights activism connects to your your commitment to nonviolence.
Yeah, well, one of the tools of nonviolence is, of course, truth-telling, documenting the violations that occur, appealing to universal standards that are acceptable to everybody, standards that are to be used with friends and foe alike. The title of the book, "The Truth Shall Set You Free." A lot of the book talks about what is truth. How do we arrive at truth? How do we document facts in a way that everybody can hear and accept them and understand them? Even our opponents, and certainly third parties. And human rights and international law provides an even playing field. Maybe we cannot compete with Israel on violence. They out-violence everybody around. I mean, they have nuclear weapons. They have massive, entirely militarized society. So we may not be able to out-violence them, but on the issues of law, on the issues of human rights, on the issues of international principles, Yeah, we can compete with them on those fields and demand certain action when we're talking about human rights. So a lot of my work, obviously, with the creation of Al-Haq, the first human rights organization, meticulously and credibly documenting what was happening, showing that the truth of the situation, realizing that even though we are fighting a very powerful propaganda apparatus that has tremendous inroads into particularly Western media, we can still try to bring about facts that everybody needs to look at and see. We still have an uphill battle, even today, trying to present our narrative and trying to present the facts. Even when they are fully documented and they're videoed and they are researched, and there are human rights organizations that can do meticulous research, we still have an uphill battle to fight. But at least it's a battle we can engage in, as opposed to the physical violence of the battlefield, where we are totally helpless, I think.
Yeah, that's a very good point there. And someone in the chat notes that they really love that idea that we can't out-violence Israel, but can compete in the areas of law and human rights. And I think there you also have the challenge of how is international law perceived by the various constituencies in the arena. And you note that you're also, I think another piece that you really bring out is a little bit the challenge of working within the Palestinian Authority and within the multiple layers of legal structures that are put on throughout time by the military, by the old Jordanian system, by the Palestinian Authority. And maybe you could just touch a little bit on that complexity of how do you navigate amidst all of those different layers of the law and different perspectives on the role of international law in the region.
Okay. You see, law can be used as a tool to oppress people. You use the law to control them, but you can't do that indefinitely, because by its very nature, law requires rules, requires application, and application has to be across the board. Even a bad law, even an evil law, carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. At the minimum, the law provides a tool for us to understand what the system is all about. I mean, apartheid was a system of laws which clearly and openly and legally discriminated against blacks and coloreds and favored whites. But the existence of the law enables people to deal with apartheid in a way that a totally amorphous situation is much harder to do. And Israel, by relying so much on law and by using law to manipulate the facts, also opens itself to the kind of critique that Al-Haq and human rights organizations can provide. When we can point to the laws, we don't have to claim and accuse Israel of apartheid when its own laws clearly designate privileges and gives those to Jews that it denies to non-Jews. Because then you say, hey, look, this is what the law says. I am not saying you are apartheid. Your laws are saying you are apartheid. And you find some people like the former head of the Shin Bet in Israel say, well, of course it's apartheid. There's separate laws applying to Jews and non-Jews. I mean, he's not a liberal. He's not a leftist. He's fully part of the security establishment. And he's saying, yes, these laws favor Jews. Of course, we are out to favor Jews at the expense of non-Jews. And you have people like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, international groups of all sorts, Israeli groups, Palestinian groups, as well as international groups. That's the nature of law, is that it is universal. It creates rules that apply across the board. And that makes it a very useful tool for anybody involved in nonviolence anywhere in the world, not just in Israel, Palestine.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I think we'll circle back for questions and answers later on, but at this point, I would like to introduce Mubarak Awad, who people have, I think everyone here probably knows Mubarak Awad. He's been inspiring people all around the world for decades through his bold, creative, and loving examples of nonviolence. He's the founder of Nonviolence International, and he's been widely celebrated by those who follow nonviolence, particularly in Palestine. But many of his neighbors have not been aware of his impact. And so one small meaningful step that was recently created to boost awareness of his long record was creating a Mubarak Awad Day in his hometown of Gaithersburg, Maryland, in celebration of his 80th birthday and lifelong commitment to nonviolence. So that is a very exciting new holiday in Gaithersburg. And so Mubarak, I'd like to turn the mic over to you now.
Thank you so much. And thanks everybody that being here. There's a few things that I like to say. First, I want to say thank you to Jonathan. And he really wrote so much in that book about me. Some I like a lot and some I don't like at all. And but he put the truth there, which is great. And I like the truth because the freedom for us as Palestinian is showing with so many Palestinians, it doesn't matter, Christian and Muslims, are writing books explaining the Nakba, explaining their own life, and both men and women, also about children and how they deal with occupation. And we are amazing by the number of people who are writing books. And I think I will bring some of those to your attention, and we will have a webinar that you could hear them. One of them is Mazen Khumsiye from Beit Sahur, who just wrote about his own involvement in nature, climate change, interested in things that we have to change the attitude of the Palestinian. We don't only think of politics, we think of our water, we think our climate. And that's an important thing. Also, I want to bring two people to your attention also, who brought the concept of Islam and nonviolence. And one of them, he left us, and his name is Abdul Aziz Saeed, who have been a mentor, but he have built a very much of a strength in how Islam and forgiveness, Islam and reconciliation, Islam and spirituality. And he built his whole life on spirituality and the meaning of it in regard to peace and community and individual growth. He also have been teaching, he have been lecturing, and now he have a chair. And this chair is going to be settled, or one fellow, which is Muhammad Abu Nimr, who I want to talk about, is a person who's going to have that chair, and he is going to do it today at 4 o'clock, and we want to congratulate him. He is also on the board. And Muhammad Abu Nimr, after graduate from Hebrew University, he came to see us in the center in Jerusalem, and he want to really tell us the story of Islam and nonviolence. I mean, the religion of Islam is salam. You cannot meet any Muslim without telling you, Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you, peace be upon you. And if you leave, peace stay with you. So he really pushed hard. Not only that, his work in Europe was able to get Muslims, Christians, and Jews together and speak about nonviolence to all of them. So he wrote books about Islam and nonviolence, and that is make it very clear that Jonathan, his spirituality through Christianity, then Muhammad Abu Nimr is also, he has spirituality through Islam, and Abdul Aziz Saeed was spirituality in being himself, which is a great leader and a great teacher on that. We have been collecting so much of around the world methods of nonviolence, and we have not particularly picked that this method is a Christian method, or this method is a Jewish method, or this method is a Muslim method. But I think after Gene Sharp wrote and collected methods, Michael Beer continued the work of Gene Sharp, and Gene Sharp have 180 or something methods. Now, Michael Beer have over 300 of those methods. And when we look at Islam and nonviolence, we also see other people who wrote books and they were persecuted because they believe Islam is nonviolent, both at their own home and also at their work. However, Nonviolence International is not a religious organization, and we accept anybody and everybody who is trying to use those methods of nonviolence. And if it's any kind of methods, we try to analyze it, we try to document it, and that, as Jonathan said, it's important to document those methods for the future generations so that they know that these methods can help them and to show all the need for this. Also, I'm very, very much interested in Jonathan because that's not his last book. Jonathan have probably 2 or 3 books ahead now, which are in different stages of chapters, and he will be waiting, and we will have him again in a different form or shape in telling us about other things. I like Jonathan so much because he will pick an idea, and knowing that this idea is dangerous, and he will explain it to all of us, especially to the Palestinians and to the Israeli, and say, hey, let's think outside this box and let's make life reality and end this crazy occupation, and this is how it can be done. So he doesn't stop by saying, this is crazy organization or this is crazy ideas. He will give explanation how it can be done and how other people also can make the best of it in helping that situation. I also admire the people who listen to us, because every time they listen to us, they have new ideas or new thoughts. And that's important for me, that we are not stale and we don't repeat ourselves. We have to look forward. We have to look on a bright light. And there are many, many, many black clouds over our head. And every cloud doesn't stay there. It's going to move. Occupation is going to move. Hard time, it's going to move. Sadness is going to move. And we have to see that all those clouds, one time, one way, they are going to move. And we will have a bright sun and nice clouds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mubarak. At this point, I think we're going to move into our question and answer session. There have already been a few that have started popping up into the chat. But we encourage you to speak your question out loud if you're able and willing. If you would like to ask a question out loud, I ask that you please raise your hand. At the bottom of the Zoom window, there is a reactions button that looks a little smiley face with a plus. You click on that and you can click raise your hand. And then when I call on you, you can unmute, ask your question, and then mute it yourself. Given the large gathering, I'm just going to remind everybody to please keep your questions as questions and not as comments, and to keep them brief so that we can do as many as possible, because we also want to have some time at the end to talk about some of the nonviolence partners and also what we can do to move forward and build on the work that has been done and is being done on the ground. So I see two hands up. Evelyn, I'll start with you, please.
Thank you so much. I read your book, Jonathan, Beyond the Two-State Solution, and it was so moved. And I understood from the most recent book that you wrote that you're talking about Israelis and Palestinians, well-meaning, Israelis who really believe in equality and dignity for all human beings to work together. How can we do this?
Okay.
Jonathan, I might take a couple questions and then maybe we can ask them collectively. So
Okay.
I think I'll let Barb and then Steve ask questions, and then we'll take a break and then we'll do a next round of questions. So Barb, maybe you can go next.
Okay. You talked about the fact that the majority of Palestinian Christians are nonviolent, but you didn't say anything about the Christian fundamentalists who are mostly not practitioners of nonviolence and have in fact allied themselves with Israel's most violent response to Palestinian cause. I'm curious if any inroads are being made into the more fundamentalist brand of Christianity.
Thank you. So I'll take one more. Steve, maybe you can ask your question, and then I'll ask one from the chat, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back for a second round of questions.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thanks. Hi, Steve in Washington. Hey, Jonathan. Just saw you. We saw each other in Philly at that fantastic Palestine Rights Literature Festival. There was a moment at that festival. I don't know if you were in the session that discussed Hassan Kanafani, and it was very packed. He's everyone who's read Kanafani is struck with the power and empathy that he has in his writing. But what seemed to get people really excited at one point was when it was emphasized that he was not he was not a proponent of nonviolence or pacifism. He, was a PFLP leader, and he defended even the violence of the hijackings, and I don't know how far he went, but what I was trying to say here is that in the room, which was packed, there was a real uptick, and people were really excited to be able to claim Kanafani as in favor of armed resistance and violence. So I wonder, in that context and more generally, how do you, Jonathan, you say, like, well, Palestinians have a right to resist armed resistance, but how do you deal with it when it comes up in a circumstance like that?
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you for that question. And I'm just going to add to those three questions, Jonathan, that there are a couple of folks who have questions that couldn't say them out loud, asking about how you feel about Dr. Martin Luther King's 6 Kingian principles of nonviolence, and also his what are the barriers and challenges to Dr. King's idea of institutionalized nonviolence?
Okay, I will try to address all 4 of them. I'll start with number 3, Ghassan Kanafani and Palestinian violence. And I'll start by quoting somebody you probably all know, who said, if my only 2 choices were violence or submission to tyranny, I will choose violence. And the person who made that speech, who made that statement, is Mahatma Gandhi. So if the only choices are submission to tyranny or violence, he would opt for violence, as would Ghassan Kanafani, as would the vast majority of Palestinians. My thesis, however, is that there is an alternative, which is nonviolence. And nonviolence is not simply giving up our guns. Nonviolence is a very powerful, active, difficult method that requires discipline, that requires sacrifice, that can in fact provide results. Most Palestinians today will opt for armed resistance simply because they don't have an understanding and access to the tools of nonviolence, and they don't see how it can really help them, even though many of them practice it daily. Prisoners use hunger strikes. Palestinians raise their flags and they protest and they use international law and they try to work on sumud and solidarity, which is all nonviolent methods. So I have no problem with Ghassan Kanafani and with those Palestinians who say armed struggle. In the book, you will find a story about Mubarak, who was having that same discussion with some of his friends. Hey, armed struggle. He said, well, why don't you go and do armed struggle? Well, we don't have any weapons. He says, get weapons. He said, well, we get weapons. You get them from your enemies. And he went outside and literally grabbed an Israeli soldier in a bear hug and dragged him down with his gun to the basement. And the poor soldier didn't know what to do. He was scared stiff. And I said, bring him some coffee. He brought some. Drink. He made him drink it. Grab your gun and get out of here. And those who want to practice violence can do so. The problem is most Palestinians cannot and do not. They practice the language of violence and armed resistance. We have not been very good at armed resistance, frankly. But that small attempt at violence and armed resistance provided Israel with all the excuse it wanted to really crush us and to continue to crush us. But if we say we're nonviolent, then it makes their life much more difficult. Their attempts at apartheid much more difficult. Their justification to themselves, to their own people, and to the world, that much more difficult to carry out. Question number 2 was about Christian fundamentalists. If you've read the book, I think you will see that a lot of it is intended to reach precisely Christians in the West by somebody who grew up in that milieu. So if you have any Christian Zionist friends, give them this book. They will be more able to read and understand it than they would most Palestinian literature that seems alien to them. Because here's a person who grew up like you in an evangelical, almost fundamentalist framework. And here is how he understands his faith in a way that brings about justice and that is more consistent with Jesus's teaching. So yes, there are some inroads being made among Christian fundamentalists. There is a real crisis today among evangelicals, particularly young people who are disenchanted with evangelical Christianity becoming an adjunct of the Republican Party. They really resent the fact that their faith is now being turned into Christian nationalism, racism, homophobia, lack of concern for the environment, as well as Christian Zionism. So yes, there are some changes taking place right now among evangelicals and among Christian fundamentalists that are very encouraging. The first question, how can Jews and Palestinians work together? Recently, if you at all read Mondevis or the writings of Fosna, Friends of Sabil, North America, and if any of you are not on our mailing list, I strongly suggest that you get on it. I've been trying to tackle that particular problem because I'm afraid the other side has made peace a bad word, has made cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians a negative thing, calling it normalization. So we need to find ways to co-resist together, not just to coexist within the current situation, which people should not accept. So finding methods of co-resistance, of joining together against the apartheid, against the oppression, against the racism, I think is the way forward. But simply getting together for dialogue, simply getting together for coexistence, simply getting together and pretending that we can somehow manage to live together without addressing the fundamental injustices of the situation, or looking at it as somehow having to do with stereotypes and having to do with not knowing each other and having to do with misunderstanding. No, it's much more fundamental than that. It has to do with a system that deliberately oppresses one group and privileges another group. If you are willing to fight against that system together, then together we can build a better future. If not, then I don't blame Palestinians for saying, I don't want to have anything to do. This is normalizing activity. I don't want to normalize the oppression that we are suffering under. Yes, how do we work together is in fact the method that we want to go. finally, the question about Dr. Martin Luther King. There is no question that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as well as Mahatma Gandhi, have been central to people who work for nonviolence anywhere in the world. And we have had tangentially some contact with the Martin Luther King Center. Again, there's an interesting story in the book, if you've read it, about how the other side is trying to co-opt Martin Luther King and set up a garden, a park in his name. The Jerusalem municipality actually started something called the Martin Luther King Memorial Park or something, and they actually used stolen olive trees that they uprooted and planted it there. We try to point out the irony of this as one of the activities. It's an interesting story in the book that you will come across. So Palestinians have to figure out what works in their context. And I think we are inspired definitely by Dr. Martin Luther King.
Thank you, Jonathan. We're going to move on to the next round of questions now. Since we were just talking about Martin Luther King, I will just put in a plug real quickly. I recently learned there's a new film out by Jen Marlowe of Donkey Saddle Production that's looking at sort of the intersection between the Black Lives Matter movement and Palestinian nonviolence. And so that's another resource people might be interested in looking at. I haven't seen the film yet, but there's some efforts to bring it to our campus. And I know there's some trailers and various educational resources available around that. So David has been waiting very patiently with his hand up. If you would like to ask your question now, and then if other people have questions, we'll do another round and then turn it back over before moving into the final section of our webinar today.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your books and your presentation and your future books. Could you tell us more how you see the nonviolent movement struggle of the Palestinians that's going on right now that needs to be strengthened and intensified in order to really win freedom and justice for the Palestinians, and also just what your own personal vision is of how that struggle can succeed?
Before I turn that question over to Jonathan, are there any other questions that people have? I don't see questions in the chat. I see lots of good resources to share. But are there any other questions people want to ask in this last round? Yes, Steve.
Yeah, so when it comes to churches, Jonathan, I bet anything you've read this one. It goes back a ways, but there was a little book that I found at the Sabeel Center, actually, called Narrow Gate Churches. And it was all about the experience of Christians in the Levant, let's say, but basically in Palestine, in Lebanon, and that because of the millet system and the dominance of Muslims in the society, they had narrow gate churches such as the Church of the Nativity Church, to keep Muslim soldiers or cavalry from riding straight into the church through the door. So the horse couldn't easily make it through that door, if you remember that door to the Church of the Nativity. And he said, overall, this meant that these churches were sort of kind of under siege in a way. I mean, they had to really watch out for their relationships with the dominant people and authorities. And so it meant they were certainly nonviolent, but they were in a sort of a bunker. I guess it's kind of a bunker mentality. So now turning to the churches today, and I think, of course, because I'm an Episcopalian, I think of the,
So Steve, could you
the Church
maybe
of Jerusalem.
switch your
How do the
question?
churches today go beyond just not being violent to being actively nonviolent?
Great, thank you very much. So we have
I'm
a
sorry to
question
go on
about
so
how-
long.
That's okay. So we have a question about how can the churches be actively nonviolent? We have a question about strengthening the movement. And I see John has a hand up, so we'll take John's question and then we'll turn it back over to Jonathan.
Well, I want to thank you, Jonathan, for your new book. I want to thank you for being the last person in Western Michigan to address anyone in person. In March of 2020, about 5 days before everything closed down in the United States, you gave us, a nice group of people in Western Michigan, an overview of Mubarak Awad's teaching on Christian Zionism, because you sensed, and I sense, it is still a really big issue that we have to face in the United States. We have now had a conference, pardon me, we've had a conference with the Foreign Affairs Advisor for Representative Heisingen, District 4 here in West Michigan. And I want to say that we are having a struggle with him because he has got the ear of our Christian Zionists here in very conservative Western Michigan. But I wanted to thank you for giving a positive review to Thomas Rick's book, Waging a Good War, which takes Martin Luther King's movement and gives it a historical context and wanting to apply it to Israel-Palestine. I thank you for answering my question earlier, and I want to pledge our solidarity with you, with the Nonviolent International people, and with the ongoing struggle to nonviolently confront the powers that be for real change. We're hoping for a tipping point. We think the grassroots is moving in the direction of nonviolently changing minds and hearts. Thank you for what you are doing, and Mubarak Awad as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan, for answering questions, and then I'll turn it over, and then we'll move on into looking ahead.
First of all, I would say yes, definitely. We seem to be approaching a tipping point. Certainly, the Palestinian message has been promulgated, heard. A lot of education has taken place, particularly in the churches, but also among students and universities, campuses. And we feel there is a change. Also, there is a clarity, precisely because of the right-wing government, the collapse of the two-state solution. There seems to be a moment where there is an openness for something different. There is an acceptance that Israel may not be everything that it was touted out to be. There is a recognition that this regime is basically an apartheid regime. There is no longer an automatic acceptance of the Israeli and the Zionist narrative, even among constituencies like the American Jewish community, like evangelicals in this country, like sectors that in the past would not even consider the Palestinian narrative. There is more an acceptance there. However, there is still tremendous power that is being exercised against the Palestinian people. There is still massive oppression at every level. There is still a siege of over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza that hardly seems to register on anybody's radar. there is still daily attacks on Palestinians by settlers as well as by soldiers. That is going on, and that is, the whole world sort of shrugs. There is still a pressure on Arab countries and Arab regimes to normalize and business as usual and have wonderful deals, arms deals and trade deals with Israel, as if Palestinians don't exist. There is still a crushing regime where every aspect of Palestinian life is subject to permits and licenses, and so that the most that people can hope for is tashilat, easing up a little bit. Give us a few more permits, allow a few more workers to work for a living. So the situation is still very fraught, and there is even talk of a second Nakba. There is actually daily, we are witnessing a second Nakba, with whole communities being ethnically cleansed openly, violently, in front of the whole world, and Israel is getting away with it. So we should not fool ourselves. The situation is still difficult and requires a lot of action. Now, where do we go from here? What is our vision? How can churches do more? How can we turn nonviolence from a sort of, we don't want to use weapons, to an active, vibrant movement, both internally and externally, putting some real pressure, putting some teeth behind it. BDS is certainly a very important tool. Legislation in Congress limiting or conditioning aid to Israel on certain behavior, whether it's the freezing of settlements or better treatment of children or lifting the siege of Gaza or whatever issues we can think of. There is still a lot to be done. What is our vision for the future? I think in my little book, Beyond the Two-State Solution, I gave some ideas of what can happen in the future. But it doesn't have to be my vision. But whatever vision we have for the future must account for the interests as well as the fears and aspirations of both sides. We really need to move beyond the slogans that have governed us for so long. We must think outside the box. We must start imagining a life together, not based on supremacy, privilege, control, and oppression, but based on equality, respect, dignity, empathy, understanding, because our fate is tied together. I know many Palestinians would say this is totally unfair. Why should we have to carry the burden of the anti-Semitism of the West? Why should we have to accommodate Jews who have been persecuted everywhere else? Why should we have to make them feel secure and safe when they are actually the ones who are daily endangering us and our safety and our security and our land? My answer to them is, we have to. This is our fate. We need to find ways to live together with dignity and on the basis of equality. I've put my vision out there in Beyond the Two-State Solution, and I welcome anybody else. What is your vision? What can you live with? Because the current situation is not acceptable. And the mirage of two states will never happen. So the reality is, your choice is apartheid or genuine equality. These are really the only two choices you have. And how can we work towards a better vision? Churches have been really, on the one hand, they have shown a lot of sympathy, but they have allowed the other side to bind them in what's called the ecumenical deal. Mark Ellis talked about the ecumenical deal. Most Jewish-Christian dialogue is mired in the ecumenical deal. We'll talk about anti-Semitism. We won't talk about the Palestinians and about justice. We'll talk about our shared roots, the Old Testament and the teachings of the Prophet, but we won't talk about justice and how that is translated in today's Israel and in today's Zionism. We need to break the ecumenical deal, break out of it into something that's good, something that's positive, something that we can live with. I think this is the task that is before us.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I think there's lots of ideas and ways that we can talk about moving forward. I appreciate your comments here and Mubarak's comments earlier. And at this point, and I appreciate all the questions everyone has raised. At this point, I'm going to turn the mic over to Tess, who is Tess Greenwood, who's a staffer for Nonviolence International, to talk a little bit more about some different ways people can take action, as well as update on some of the Nonviolent International activities and actions and groups and resources, some that were mentioned by Mubarak earlier. So Tess, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you everybody for your participation today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tess. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the office and intern manager of Nonviolence International. I'm also a member and organizer with If Not Now, which is the movement of American Jews working to end our community's support for Israeli apartheid and occupation. So like Mubarak mentioned earlier, I'm going to touch a bit on that when we get into this really great resource that we've compiled. I'm going to drop a link in the chat, but I'm also going to share my screen. So you can choose if you want to follow along on your own browser or with the screen share. And also, if you can, bookmark this for later so you can return to it. This is a really great compilation of lots of different kinds of resources and links to not only our partners, but also other really important actors and key organizations within the movement struggling for justice in Palestine. So here's that link. And then I am going to share my screen. Really enjoyed the Q&A session. Really appreciated hearing like all of the questions that were coming up for you all as we were hearing Jonathan and Mubarak talk a bit about the work that they've done in their lives, and also Jonathan's most recent book, as well as Beyond the Two-State Solution. And yeah, just really appreciate the participation today. We're hoping that you'll continue that after we log off. And this page is a really great place to start plugging into different things or learn more, depending on where you're at and what you're interested in. So we think this would be a really good spot, whether you've been involved in the movement for justice in Palestine for a long time, or you're new to it and you want to learn more. This is like a great one-stop shop that'll take you to other one-stop shops where you can learn more. So I'm just going to highlight some key items on this list. You can see if you are scrolling throughout, and I'll do that now. This is organized into action items. There's also a section where you can check out different social media accounts that we feel are like pretty pertinent to follow. Many of the accounts you see listed here are not organizations themselves, maybe with the exception of Youth of Samud. These are activists on the ground. Many of them are in Masaf in the south of the West Bank. And then also we have some partners, social media on here as well. And then there's some background information. So Jonathan's first book, Beyond the Two-State Solution, is linked here. You can download a free PDF of that at this link. Also, his most recent article that he mentioned that was published on Mondoweiss is also on our website and the Friends of Civil North America website, titled Normalization and Co-Resistance. It gets into some of the, like, as Jonathan has already said, getting into some of the contours of normalizations and implications for joint Arab and Jewish co-resistance. Number of articles by NVI interns and other friends of NVI, some videos of previous webinars and other things like that. And then here in this last section, there are lots of different resources from other orgs and other groups. For me, I know the visualizing apartheid through interactive maps from B'Tselem was really key for me before I was able to spend time on the ground with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, which is one of NVI's partners I'll get to in a second. These maps from B'Tselem really help you visualize and understand the concept of divide and conquer in a way that I hadn't really seen before, and I think they're really worth checking out. So back up at the top here, I'm just going to dig into some of these key action items. Firstly, I'm going to actually open them up. The U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights has an action alerts page that you can regularly check for ongoing petitions, open letters, other ways of reaching members of Congress and other public figures. Looks like right now they've got a petition going to targeting a band that was going to be playing in Israel and asking them to cancel their show. There are some other ongoing actions like signing on to the letter asking Congress to stop funding, stop giving military aid, unconditional military aid to Israel, as well as defending land defense and community defense in Masafer Yatta. Another way you can take action very quickly and easily online is by signing on to the Reject AIPAC campaign. This is a project and campaign of If Not Now, which is a movement I am a part of, for the disclaimer. But yeah, I think we didn't talk about AIPAC today, but for those of you who aren't familiar, AIPAC's the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and they lobby against Palestinian human rights in Congress. And they, in general, work to maintain unconditional U.S. support for Israel through a number of tactics that silence progressives and also empower and embolden far right and other hateful politicians who are working against Palestinian rights. Despite saying they're bipartisan, they do fund candidates on both sides of the aisle, but they generally work to empower right-wing candidates in local, state, and national elections. Yeah, it says that in this brief blurb. They've endorsed over 100 Republicans who voted to decertify the results of the 2020 election. They've allied themselves with the far right, people who participated in or support the insurrection in 2021, support all kinds of things that really don't speak for American Jewish values, and they claim to be a representative of that. So yeah, really invite you to add your name to the growing list of Americans who are calling on our electeds and our communal leaders to reject AIPAC. You do not need to be Jewish to sign this. There will be an option to say that. I think everyone's voice really matters on this, and being counted really makes a difference, showing that there really is this mass popular opposition to AIPAC's power and to the way that they interfere in our elections and in our democracy. Yeah, it's really important. So definitely invite you to check that out, read the letter, sign it. And then I'm just going to touch on our fiscally sponsored partners for a second. We have a number of fiscally sponsored partners in Palestine, including We Are Not Numbers, which is a youth-led media training program in Gaza. They frequently publish articles and videos telling the stories of the people behind the numbers that we hear in the news. Holy Land Trust seeks to develop spiritual, pragmatic, and strategic approaches that empower Palestinian communities to resist all forms of oppression, both through nonviolence programs, training, and otherwise, and also travel and encounter experiences. So you can check out if there's an upcoming program you might want to join. And then the U.S. Advisory Committee for the Hebron International Resource Network does the necessary and important work of rebuilding wells, playgrounds, schools, homes, other things that have been demolished or are needed by the community throughout the West Bank, especially in areas where land confiscation and land defense is very active and necessary, which is pretty much everywhere. And then there's the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. They bring diaspora Jews from all over the world to engage in co-resistance and direct action with Palestinians who are defending their land and communities against Israeli occupation and apartheid. I've been really lucky to join the Center for Jewish Nonviolence on the ground in Palestine several times in the last year. And yeah, invite you to reach out to me, to them, check them out through our website, their website, if you're interested in joining one of their programs or being on their list. The U.S. Votes to Gaza, or U.S. Vote to Gaza, represents the U.S. in the International Freedom Flotilla Coalition, which is a grassroots, people-to-people solidarity movement composed of campaigns from around the world that are working together to end the illegal blockade of Gaza from air, land, and sea. And Soul is actually a project of the Hebron International Resource Network, and they use the power of music to promote change in difficult circumstances, particularly in Hebron in Palestine. So yeah, last but certainly not least, we've talked a bit about books today, quite a bit about books today, and rightly so. If you have read either The Truth Shall Set You Free or Beyond the Two-State Solution, we strongly encourage you to write a review and post it online, whether that's Google reviews or on Amazon or your local bookstore's website, wherever you see fit. It really makes a difference in, we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you thought. We also want other people to hear your thoughts and have that conversation happening in the reviews. And also it's, it'll really invite more people into the conversation. So yes, really strongly invite you to write a review if you haven't already. And I believe that's pretty much everything. We can drop some of these links in the chat again, the link to Jonathan's new book, to Beyond the Two-State Solution, and also to this page. And yeah, I'll pass it off to Jonathan, I think.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that last suggestion that you made. And I must say, I am new to this whole thing about publishing books. Unlike what Mubarak said, basically, I'm not, I'm not a writer as such. Every day I'd come back home and my wife would tell me, you ought to write a book. Because I tell her what happened to me that day, and she says, you have so many stories to tell, you ought to write a book. So now that I've written a book, I realize that book distribution is a whole industry. And most publishers don't really do much marketing. They want bestsellers that they can make a lot of money on. The only way books do get distributed is mostly through word of mouth, mostly through reviews that people write. And I was told by Amazon, by Barnes and Nobles, basically, we want to see how many people already buy your book, how many people write a review, even if it's just one paragraph or a couple of sentences. I really enjoyed this book. Anybody should read it who is interested in peace, etc. The more reviews they get, the more they are inclined to mention your book or list it at a higher level or make sure it gets distributed. So we got Christmas coming up. Somebody asked about Christian Zionists and the churches. Well, if you have a friend who is in that milieu, in that category, give them this book for Christmas as a gift, because I really think that it has a message that they could read and that they could enjoy, and that may change their minds. So I would strongly urge you to do a review, write up a few sentences, and of course, if you can write a detailed review and get it in the New York Review of Books, well, all the better. By the way, this book is also going to be available in audio. I have many friends who don't really read books, but who may listen to a book on audio. So it is going to be available in audio. In about a week or so, it will be available on Audible books, as well as the usual. I think they have Amazon Audible and some other Spotify or something like that. So look out for the book in audio, and do write a review and do send it to your friends. Beyond the Two-State Solution, by the way, is available from Nonviolence International website for free. You can just download the PDF of that book. So yes, this is, after all, supposed to be a book launch and a book about the book. So this is the way to really promote a book. That's how people read. They get the book and they read it.
Yeah, and I would also encourage groups to invite Jonathan to speak about his book, or organize a book club, or those of you who teach or are in part of groups that organize collective readings and discussions. There are lots of different ways you can promote a book and spread the word about it creatively. And I'm very glad to hear that you're doing an audiobook version as well. I listen to most of my books now on audio that are not for work while walking the dogs or driving long distances. It's a great way to maximize my efficiency. So I think there's lots of interesting ways people can chime into this. I'm aware that we're almost at the end of our time today. So I just wanted to check in briefly to make sure there's, it doesn't look like Mohammed Abu Nimr was able to join us today, but we can pass on our congratulations for his stepping into this new Abdulaziz Saeed endowed chair role later on today. I'm very sorry I cannot be there in person. So Betty, please pass on my greetings if you attend when you're there. I just want to do one last check-in to see if Tess or Jonathan and Mubarak, any of you had any last action items to share for the group before we wrap up this webinar today?
That, yeah, if you're leading a book group, bringing this to a book club, to your congregation, to another community space, whether it's Beyond the Two-State Solution or the Truth Shall Set You Free, please reach out to us if you'd like to connect with Jonathan or Mubarak or another leader of NVI, or someone we can connect you to if you would like someone to speak to that book club, congregation, other space that you brought the book to.
Excellent. Yes, so many word of mouth is one of the best ways of passing the word on about books and engaging people in discussions about it. Okay, so I think we're just about at the end of our time today. Thank you again to everybody for joining. Thank you to Jonathan and Mubarak for your work and for the 2 books that you've written and the more to come, Jonathan. That's wonderful. Thank you, Michael, and everybody for organizing. And please make sure you check out that page of resources that Tess put in the chat. That's where all of the links to all of those resources she was sharing on the screen can be accessed directly. Right. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day and the rest of your week, and launch into October with all of these great ideas for nonviolent activism. Have a great day.